Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. This week I'm talking to Andrew McNeile, the Chief Customer Officer of ThinScale Technology in Dublin, Ireland. Now you might recall that a couple of weeks ago, Michael DeSalles of Frost and Sullivan mentioned ThinScale on this podcast. And he was talking about how their technology makes bring your own device much safer for work at home agents. I followed up that podcast by writing a blog exploring the millions of dollars being spent by contact centers on laptops, and not just the cost of buying them, but shipping them to agents, losing the ones that are never returned or losing the ones that get broken. Andrew commented on that blog on my LinkedIn, and so I called him up to find out a bit more about how bring your own device could change the way that people work from home. Right, you commented on my recent blog about the cost of shipping laptops to agents, and I saw several other people from the industry commenting. Immediately there was Felix Sejano from Activus saying, your numbers are completely conservative and the reality is much, much worse than this. What have you been hearing from the industry and your clients?
Well, I think, Mark, the interesting thing is that as we bring some of this to people, they're seeing it as insight, because I think the reality is really that only one or two of them have done the real due diligence to understand the numbers. As you lay it out very nicely there is quite a complexity to it, because there are multiple components in the process, and therefore you've really got to get your head around it. I think, personally, what I'm hearing back is I think your numbers are best in class in terms of a US setting. I think everybody in the industry all knows that the attrition numbers are worse than the ones that you're quoting, but things will fluctuate by region. So I think that represents, as Felix was articulating, the kind of situation in the US. But indeed, as you allude to in Eastern Europe, I think you can be much tighter in terms of how you manage your agents, and therefore you can get stuff back. But then in Asia again, you're finding yourself in a more similar situation to the US. So very much varies by region and by attitude to the workforce and by the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think the key thing, though, that isn't addressed in your piece is the volume surges. Because when you've got things like Black Friday, it's very, very hard to make hardware device shipment work out.
Yeah. I sort of mentioned about the you're going to have a massive stock. You're going to have laptops sitting around in the cupboard just so you can deal with seasonality, and It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
Exactly.
Clearly there was an emergency response. Everybody was shocked by COVID, and so in March and April we saw all the BPOs having to send everybody home. So they had to go to Dell and the other manufacturers and place orders for thousands of laptops. But, that was an emergency response. How are they going to build a longer term strategy then?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it clearly needs a longer term strategy. I think work from home has changed forever. Even if the exact shape of it is not clear to any of us, the broad outlines of it are, and the genie is clearly out of the bottle. That great ghost of the fear of lack of productivity, I think that's been banished forever. And, it's clearly everybody has seen that, we're proven that we have that capacity to work at home. It's going to be some kind of blended model, but I don't think any of us know exactly how it's going to pan out yet. But I think all the leading BPOs, in my experience, are working on some kind of long-term strategy with various degrees of sophistication. I think it needs to be blended. It's got to be highly flexible, completely secure, and capable of rapid deployment. And I think almost all of them will involve BYOD plus a hardware device shipment option in their solution stack.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I was going to ask, is around bring your own device, BYOD. It seems that because of the pandemic, we've proven the work from home model. The productivity is there, the security is there, but it still seems that on top of that, there's another level of shyness around BYOD.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And you're asking me why?
Basically, why does that still exist when we've had this kind of baptism of fire over the last 6 months?
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right. There is still a shyness around it. I think there are three main reasons for that. I think the first reason is a narrow view of customer centricity. So BPOs particularly, I think, are responding to their customers who think purely in terms of security equals device shipment. And therefore, their customer says, please ship a device. So the BYOD, the BPO is saying, yeah, okay, we'll ship a device as you require, and think that they're being customer centric. And they're not willing to offer insight in terms of another methodology and another approach. And in that way, I think they're failing to go down the challenger sales model. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular book and articulation, but I think the more successful BPOs are the ones who are going to be going, look, we can do that, but we could do this, and look at all the benefits that exist for you. And my experience when I'm working with my customers is if I bring to them insights about a different approach they could take, they really appreciate that, and they appreciate the challenge. So I think that's the first point, this narrow view of customer centricity. Secondly, I think they just see it as a cost of doing business. So they say, we've got to ship devices, so we've got to get them out there. And then they don't dig into all these different component parts and add them up together. And then thirdly, I think they're just unaware of the developments that have been, technology developments that have taken place that can make BYOD secure, such as people like companies like ourselves who've really taken that technology development, who've got hundreds of thousands of deployments and have got it to a level of government level deployment and testing, where with real rigor from the top level of security to ensure that it's bringing that kind of security. So I think those are the three reasons that are still holding people back. But eventually, I think the inevitability of the argument is going to win over.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you if it's even possible to build a large-scale work-from-home strategy without using BYOD. But I guess from what you just said, it would only work if you're operating at a small scale.
I agree. I think it's, I don't think you can build an effective work at home strategy without at least including BYOD in your answer. And I think that, again, I think there are three reasons. As we've already discussed, you can't cope effectively with rapid surges. I think secondly, there's this whole issue of the benefit of being able to recruit from anywhere. So the more sophisticated BPOs have seen it, and often the BYOD strategy was led by top-level executives, like the chairman from Teleperformance and the global CIO of Teleperformance and the CEO of T-Tech. These kind of guys were actually the ones who instinctively saw it and drove it. The benefit of recruit from anywhere is, for example, let's say you want Swedish as a language in your skill set and your primary call center is based in Greece. Up until now, some BPOs have been recruiting in Sweden, flying them to Athens, putting them in a flat in Athens. You think of all the organizational complexity around that. It's just bananas. Whereas if you can recruit them in Sweden, allow them to use their own devices, not have to get into the complexity, do BYOD, it's going to improve it. And then, Mark, I think as you and I have both seen, the cost and operational advantages are just overwhelming. And ecologically, as we've said already, it's a no-brainer. So I don't think by any means it'll be exclusively BYOD, but I cannot see best-in-class BPOs not having this in their technology stack.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you just said about things like multilingual hubs. Do they actually have a future? I was on a 5CA webinar earlier this week. And it was like Steve Lloyd, Peter Ryan, all the analyst community. And pretty much we concluded then that if you need languages from all across Europe, then why not just recruit the agents where they are in those different countries?
Exactly. I think I couldn't agree with you more, Mark. I think that's exactly the road. And you see it particularly in Europe, where you've got this concentration of multiple languages and spread out across many different environments. You've got French in the offshores in Morocco and Casablanca. You've got German going back into Eastern Europe, but you've got a lot of different types of languages as well. and particularly, for example, in Russia, all the different sort of Slavic languages that they're wanting to recruit, and recruit across vast distances when you get into that. So yes, I think that is one of the compelling reasons for it.
Yeah, I mean, another trend in the industry generally at the moment is GigCX, and gig workers, naturally come to the job with their own equipment. So do you think that the rise in GigCX will see a change in attitudes towards BYOD?
Yes, is that going to be the driver? I think the attitudes will come, the drive for BYOD will come for all the reasons we've discussed. But I think the whole question of GigCX is another aspect on top of it. I mean, I think you and Peter are already tracking this well. I was listening to another of your podcasts earlier where you were really focusing on this, and I thought a lot of good points coming out. I think my own perception of it is that it's still an early stage on the adoption of the innovation curve. It's in that early stage adoption. And there's a lot of refining, I think, still to be done to the model as a whole as it applies to the BPO. But it's beginning to get adopted in a variety. You guys were talking about a couple of specific examples. I could think of a couple more, and a couple who are sort of playing with that as a component within their model. But I think that as I reflected on it, you can see in other parts of the economy significant growth in gig as an approach to working. So I think it's very likely that if you're seeing that model being deployed widely in other parts of the economy, it's going to flow back in and have an impact on the BPO industry.
Yeah. Well, I just wrote a book about GigCX, so you can expect that'll be on Amazon anytime soon.
Okay, very good. Okay. Look forward to it.
I mean, finally then, just to wrap up, because I think that we've covered off the stuff pretty well around the BYOD and the BPO's shipping laptops. I mean, what advice would you give to a BPO today if they came to you and said, look, we never realized we would be spending $2 million plus just on operating a laptop retrieval process? I mean, how would you help them to manage their 2021 budget then?
I think the nice thing, Mark, about the BPO industry is despite its scale and size, it still feels like quite a small community where lots of us know one another, and many of the people in the BPO industry move from one company to another and therefore have connections and relationships across the industry. And so I think my advice to them would be to do the same thing that I would do if I was in their place, and indeed that I do for my own company when I'm trying to solve a problem like this. And that would be to go and speak to others who've been this way before. It's always good to go and find a colleague who's gone down the BYOD deployment and said, what did you do? How did you approach it? What's worked for you? And indeed, I would say many of the people who are coming to us at the moment, they're coming to us via that road. I went and talked to this company or that company, and they're using your stuff here. Can you tell me a bit more about it? But it's that getting informed from somebody who's actually traveled down that road, been down there, and then, because then you're not sort of having to guinea pig the whole thing yourself. You can, follow in the footsteps of somebody else, learn from their mistakes, and try and get best in class that you can find across the industry. But I do think that BYOD will become a permanent part of the solution. And so I think clearly from where I'm standing, looking at how you're going to do that and do that effectively is going to be a part of a solution to that particular problem.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.